Have you ever heard the phrase, words can kill? Not metaphorically, not poetically, but literally. What if I told you that one of America's most iconic literary giants may have ended a woman's life, not with a weapon, but with a telephone call? That a single, rage-filled conversation, uttered in a moment of cruelty, triggered a fatal cascade inside the body of the woman who once gave up everything to build him into a legend? It sounds outrageous, even scandalous, but it's real, and it happened. Welcome to the channel, where we don't just revisit history, interrogate it. If you're tired of one-sided narratives and selective memory, you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button, because the truths we're uncovering here won't be found in your high school textbooks. This is the other side of the Hemingway myth, and it's a side that deserves to be heard. Today's story isn't about Ernest Hemingway, the war hero, the Nobel Prize winner, the man's man who hunted lions and wrote like thunder. This isn't a celebration of genius. It's a post-mortem on the collateral damage genius often leaves behind. And the name of that collateral damage? Pauline Pfeiffer. Not just his second wife. Not just a name on the family tree of Hemingway's romances. Pauline was a woman of wit, wealth, and unwavering loyalty. She wasn't a muse. She was the machinery. She didn't just love him, she bankrolled him, edited him, defended him, and ultimately, she died because of him. Now I know what some of you are thinking. Wasn't she the other woman? The one who broke up his first marriage to Sweet Hadley? That's the popular version. The simplified triangle told in documentaries and literary footnotes. Ernest, the brilliant young writer. Hadley, the nurturing first wife. And Pauline, the fashionable seductress who swooped in with money and lipstick. It's tidy, it's cinematic, and it's wrong, or at least deeply incomplete. Pauline Pfeiffer was not some wide-eyed socialite who stumbled into a Parisian drama. She was a University of Missouri-trained journalist, a sharp mind working at Vogue magazine in 1920s Paris, the epicenter of culture and modernism. She wasn't trailing Hemingway's fame, she arrived with her own. Imagine that for a second. A woman in her 20s, financially independent, publishing in one of the most prestigious magazines in the world, walking into smoke-filled salons not as a date but as a peer. When she met Hemingway, it wasn't some seduction of the vulnerable artist by a rich woman. In fact, it was Hemingway who saw in her a life raft. Pauline had what he needed, not just money, but influence, refinement, strategic insight. She wasn't a fan of his talent. She understood it. She helped mold it. That's a power dynamic nobody wants to talk about because it disrupts the romantic myth of the lone, tortured male genius. But let's move forward. Hemingway divorces Hadley. Pauline becomes the new Mrs. Hemingway. And for a time, it works. They settle in Key West. And thanks to her wealthy family, specifically her uncle's deep pockets, they purchase and renovate what would become one of the most iconic literary homes in America. She commissions the first in-ground swimming pool in the Florida Keys, manages their household, raises their children, and even edits Hemingway's manuscripts. Yes, you heard that right. Pauline wasn't just folding his shirts and planning cocktail parties. She was offering structural edits on A Farewell to Arms. When you admire that book, you are, whether you know it or not, also admiring her touch. But this isn't a fairy tale. Because beneath the glamour was a growing fracture. A wound that couldn't heal. After a traumatic first pregnancy that nearly killed her, Pauline was told another childbirth could be fatal. And as a devout Catholic, she was caught in a vice. Contraception was forbidden by her faith. Intimacy was complicated by risk. Hemingway, who thrived on physicality, grew restless, and eventually, predictably, he strayed. Enter Martha Gellhorn, war correspondent. Brilliant, fierce, everything Pauline wasn't. Hemingway was electrified. And just like that, Pauline became the woman left behind, the mirror image of the very wife she had once replaced. And here's where the story turns cruel. Pauline didn't go quietly. She tried to fight. She visited Hemingway at the Spanish front. She redecorated their Key West home with Spanish furniture, hoping to mirror the world that had captured his imagination. She begged. She waited. She hoped. But Hemingway had already moved on emotionally and physically. In 1940, he filed for divorce. 3 weeks later, he married Martha. Pauline never remarried. You'd think that was the end of the story. A woman scorned, fading into the background. But what if I told you that her most tragic chapter hadn't even happened yet? Because in 1951, years after the divorce, something unthinkable occurred. Their youngest son, Gregory, struggling with gender identity and arrested in California for entering a women's restroom, made a desperate phone call. Not to his mother, to Hemingway. And Hemingway, reportedly drunk and enraged, responded with scorn, shame, and blame. Then, in an act of almost Shakespearean cruelty, he called Pauline and unloaded his fury. He blamed her, accused her of ruining their son, told her things we can only imagine. And just hours later, Pauline collapsed in agony. The doctors couldn't save her. The official cause of death? Shock. At first, that sounded poetic, vague, convenient. But her son, burdened with guilt, later became a doctor himself. He pulled the autopsy report. He found the truth. Pauline had an undiagnosed tumor on her adrenal gland. A rare condition. Invisible. Silent. But under acute stress, it could explode. And it did. That phone call, that outburst, didn't just break her heart metaphorically. It quite literally killed her. Let that sink in. This isn't just a story about failed marriages or literary drama. This is a story about emotional violence, about the unseen cost of devotion, and about the bodies women have buried in service to men's legacies. Hemingway wasn't holding a weapon, but his words, his fury, his carelessness, they were just as lethal. And maybe that's the conversation we've avoided for too long. Stay with us, because in the next segment, we'll dissect the myth of Hemingway's genius, the systemic silencing of women like Pauline, and the uncomfortable truth behind our cultural obsession with tortured men and the women who suffer for their art. To understand the full weight of Pauline Pfeiffer's tragedy, we need to step back, not just emotionally, but chronologically, because this wasn't a sudden downfall. It was a slow, quiet erosion, not a collapse, but a gradual hollowing out of a woman's life until there was almost nothing left but devotion, disappointment, and, eventually, silence. Her story didn't begin with heartbreak. It began with ambition. Pauline was born into privilege. Her family, the Pfeiffers, were well-off Midwestern Catholics, connected and respected. But she wasn't content to be just another society daughter. She had a sharp intellect and a restless drive that pushed her toward journalism, an unusual path for women of her class and era. She studied at the University of Missouri School of Journalism, and later joined Vogue in Paris. Not as an intern, not as an assistant, as an editor. Let's pause there. In the 1920s, most women in journalism were relegated to women's pages, filled with recipes and etiquette tips. Pauline was operating in the heart of the fashion literary complex of Paris, rubbing shoulders with designers, editors, and the literati of the lost generation. She wasn't some passive bystander to history. She was shaping it quietly, stylishly, and efficiently. It was 1925 when fate took its first cruel turn. F. Scott Fitzgerald introduced her to Ernest Hemingway. At the time, Hemingway was still a struggling writer, married to Hadley Richardson, and living a modest life. Pauline, by contrast, was thriving. She had money, elegance, and a byline. But it wasn't love at first sight. At first, It was a friendship. Pauline and her sister Jenny became close with the Hemingways. They spent evenings together, laughing over cheap wine and reading drafts aloud. And here's where the narrative begins to shift. Pauline was everything Hadley wasn't. Where Hadley was warm and maternal, Pauline was cosmopolitan and sharp. Hadley was weary of their hand-to-mouth existence. Pauline had an expense account and a press pass. She was, quite literally, a glimpse of a different life. Hemingway was fascinated not just by her beauty or wealth, but by her worldliness. She understood the publishing industry. She could talk to him not only about prose, but about promotion. Not just literature, but legacy. The affair began in 1926. Hemingway would later write about it with self-loathing in his memoir, A Movable Feast, painting himself as a tragic figure torn between two women. But in the process, he reduced Pauline to a caricaturous seductress, a disruptor. What he didn't acknowledge was that she, too, was tormented. Pauline was a devout Catholic. The affair gnawed at her conscience. But love real. Overwhelming love overrode everything. And Hemingway, in all his brilliance and volatility, had that effect on people. He was a storm you didn't survive so much as surrender to. That summer, the group traveled to Pamplona for the Festival of San Fermin. It should have been a joyful trip. Instead, it was a pressure cooker. The tension between Hadley and Pauline became unbearable. Hadley finally confronted Hemingway. What followed was an extraordinary agreement. Hadley told him that if, after 100 days of separation, he still loved Pauline, she would grant him a divorce. 100 days. Think about that. It sounds noble, graceful, but beneath that surface lies something far more painful. A woman giving her husband permission to fall in love with someone else. Pauline, during this test, wrote letters filled with anguish and confusion. "I am the guiltiest person in the world," she wrote, "but I am not a bit sorry." That line alone is a psychological inkblot test, both confession and declaration. She knew she was crossing a line, but she also knew she was too far gone to turn back. The 100 days passed. The love endured. Hadley, true to her word, agreed to the divorce. In May 1927, Hemingway married Pauline. And just like that, the triangle collapsed into a straight line. But if Pauline thought this marked the beginning of a new life, one of shared success and partnership, she was wrong. What followed was a subtle but relentless erasure of her contributions. They moved to Key West, a sleepy island outpost that Pauline transformed into a literary retreat. She oversaw renovations, planted tropical gardens, and commissioned the now famous swimming pool, a move that earned her both admiration and ridicule. The pool cost a small fortune. Hemingway's sarcastic quip, pressing a penny into the wet cement and saying, "Take my last cent," became legend. But behind the joke was a truth. Pauline was pouring everything into making a home, a sanctuary, for a man who was already starting to drift emotionally. She wasn't just decorating. She was building a fortress around his genius. A writing studio in the garden, carefully managed guest lists, unseen labor that allowed him to write undisturbed, surrounded by comfort and order. And perhaps most importantly, she was his editor. A Farewell to Arms, widely regarded as one of his greatest works, bears her fingerprints. She suggested cuts, restructured passages, and, some argue, pushed for a more hopeful ending. Not because she didn't understand tragedy, but because she was already living one. In public, they were the golden couple. They traveled, they entertained, they posed for photos that still circulate today. But in private, their marriage was cracking. The birth of their first son, Patrick, was traumatic. Pauline required a cesarean section. Doctors warned her another pregnancy could kill her. But as a Catholic, contraception was not an option. What followed was a silent war between biology, faith, and desire. Hemingway, who prized vitality and physicality, grew cold. The intimacy faded. Pauline, caught between doctrine and survival, withdrew emotionally. Their second son, Gregory, was born under medical risk and religious guilt. The marriage began to wither not from scandal, but from the slow poison of unmet needs and unspoken fear. And then, as if pulled by some cosmic repetition, Hemingway began to wander again, this time into the arms of Martha Gellhorn, a war correspondent, independent, unapologetic. Pauline, now cast in the role once held by Hadley, fought to save what was left. She visited Hemingway in Spain. She tried to reclaim his attention with gestures, letters, even interior design. But it wasn't enough. In 1940, Hemingway formally ended the marriage. 3 weeks later, he married Martha. Pauline stayed in the house she had built, surrounded by memories, raising their sons alone. She never remarried. By the time Hemingway married Martha Gellhorn in 1940, Pauline Pfeiffer was no longer a wife, she was a remnant. A woman left standing in the ruins of a house she had built brick by emotional brick. But she didn't publicly unravel. She didn't stage a scandal, write a memoir, or attempt to reclaim her dignity through revenge. No, Pauline chose restraint. She remained in Key West. She raised her sons. She maintained appearances. But beneath that carefully curated composure was a woman who had been gutted by a man whose love she once believed would be her redemption. And that's the part of her story we rarely confront, the quiet disintegration that doesn't make headlines but leaves permanent scars. Pauline wasn't simply rejected. She was overwritten. History treated her like a placeholder between Hadley and Martha. Hemingway himself seemed to erase her from his narrative arc, reducing her role to that of the wealthy interlude before his real adventures resumed. And yet, without her, those adventures might never have happened. This is where things get uncomfortable, because we're not just talking about one woman's heartbreak anymore. We're talking about a paternocultural pathology, the way brilliant, ambitious men often require the emotional labor, financial sacrifice, and even spiritual contortions of the women around them. Pauline was expected to be the perfect wife, the perfect hostess, the perfect editor, and the perfect mother, all while being slowly diminished by the very man she empowered. And when she was no longer inspiring, she was discarded. But Pauline didn't disappear. She remained a devoted mother, especially to her youngest son, Gregory, nicknamed Gigi. Gregory was not an easy child to raise. And that's not a moral judgment. It's a statement of historical and psychological fact. He struggled deeply with his gender identity, something that in 1950s America was not just misunderstood, it was pathologized, criminalized, and condemned. Pauline, a Catholic woman from a conservative family, was thrust into an emotional and moral maelstrom. But unlike her ex-husband, she didn't respond with condemnation or cruelty. She responded with concern. Gregory's internal torment manifested in erratic behavior. He was anxious, impulsive, and confused. He lived in a time where there was no language, no safe space for what he was feeling. Pauline tried to protect him from the world and, when necessary, from his father, because Hemingway, despite whatever affection he may have felt for his son, was incapable of nuance. He was a man of sharp lines and violent judgments. Anything that deviated from his rigid notion of masculinity was treated as betrayal. This toxic dynamic came to a head on a single day in late 1951. Gregory, who was living in California at the time, was arrested after an incident at a movie theater. Reports vary, but the common thread is this: Gregory entered the women's restroom, some say, while wearing women's clothing. Others suggest he was simply in a disoriented state. Whatever the specifics, it was enough to get him detained by police. And in a moment of panic, Gregory made a decision that would become a tragic catalyst. He used his one phone call not to contact his mother, the person who had always defended him, but his father. And Hemingway, ever the absolutist, did what Hemingway often did. He detonated. According to those close to the family, he lashed out, berating his son for bringing shame to the family name. He called him names, attacked his identity, and dished out blame in every direction but inward. And when he hung up on his own child, he wasn't finished. He picked up the phone again, and this time, he called Pauline. We can only imagine what was said in that conversation. There is no transcript, no tape, just what we know from witnesses and family members. Hemingway reportedly accused her of coddling Gregory, of being a bad mother, of being responsible for the failure of their son. And here's where the line between metaphor and medical fact vanishes. Shortly after that phone call, Pauline collapsed in pain. She clutched her abdomen and was rushed to the hospital by her sister. Within hours, she was dead. The cause listed on the death certificate? Shock. For decades, that explanation was treated as symbolic, a poetic way of saying her heart was broken again. But it turns out the truth was far more literal. Gregory, racked with guilt, grief, and confusion, would later become a doctor. And in an act of both penance and pursuit of clarity, he obtained his mother's autopsy report. What he found changed everything. Pauline had been suffering from a rare, undiagnosed tumor called a pheochromocytoma. It grows silently on the adrenal gland and secretes massive amounts of adrenaline. Most of the time, it lies dormant. But when triggered, especially by intense emotional stress, it can rupture, flooding the body with a lethal surge of hormones. It causes the blood pressure to spike dramatically, leading to strokes, cardiac arrest, and sudden death. The fatal trigger, in this case, wasn't physical exertion. It was a phone call, a verbal assault, a moment of verbal violence so intense that it quite literally became physiological trauma. In other words, Hemingway's rage didn't just scar Pauline emotionally. It stopped her heart. And that's not metaphor. That's medicine. This detail rewrites the narrative of her entire life. Pauline wasn't just a woman scorned. She was a woman who died as a direct result of emotional violence. Her body, worn down by years of tension, silence, and heartbreak, could no longer withstand the very man who had once vowed to love her. And here's the part that deserves our collective attention. How many other women past and present carry similar burdens? How many suffer not in grand, dramatic ways, but in quiet, corrosive ones that eventually reach their breaking point? Because Pauline's story is not unique. What makes it chilling is how ordinary it really is. How familiar. In Part 4, we'll take this deeper. We'll explore how society has sanitized the myth of Hemingway, what Pauline's life says about the erasure of women in historical narratives, and how cultural idolization of male genius often requires a sacrificial lamb, someone to be used, loved, and then blamed. Her name was Pauline Pfeiffer. She didn't die in a war. She didn't overdose in a hotel room. She died at the end of a telephone line, under the weight of a life lived too long in someone else's shadow. In the aftermath of Pauline Pfeiffer's death, there was no public outcry, no headlines, no cultural reckoning, no re-examination of the Hemingway myth. She was buried quietly, and history moved on as if nothing extraordinary had happened, as if her death was just another line in the obituary column of a man's life. And maybe that's the real tragedy, because Pauline didn't just die of a rare tumor or from the shock of a phone call. She died from something far more common, far more insidious: erasure. The slow, societal deletion of her contributions, her sacrifices, and her voice. She became what too many women become when they are no longer useful to the narrative of a powerful man. A footnote. Let's talk about that narrative. Ernest Hemingway is, to this day, revered as a towering figure in American literature. He's taught in schools, romanticized in biopics, quoted endlessly. We remember him as the rugged sportsman, the war hero, the man of few words but deep thoughts. But rarely, if ever, do we examine the emotional debris he left behind. Rarely do we interrogate what it means to build a legend on the backs of women who were, time and again, expected to carry the emotional labor, provide financial support, and then vanish when their chapter was done. Hadley Richardson was the muse of simplicity and sacrifice. Pauline was the muse of wealth and structure. Martha Gellhorn was the muse of war and defiance. And after them came Mary Welsh, who stood beside him as he declined into paranoia and ultimately suicide. Each woman was assigned a role in Hemingway's creative evolution as if they were necessary stepping stones in his personal mythology. But that kind of thinking isn't just romantic. It's destructive. It frames women not as full, complex beings, but as plot devices in a male-centered story. So here's the question: why do we still accept this model? Why are we so willing to believe that artistic genius must be fueled by suffering, and specifically, by the suffering of others? Why is it that when a male creator behaves selfishly, cruelly, or even abusively, we excuse it under the banner of brilliance? He was difficult, we say, but he was a genius. As though pain inflicted by a celebrated man is somehow more justified, more poetic, more acceptable. Pauline Pfeiffer was not difficult. She was not dramatic. She did everything that was asked of her and more. She supported Hemingway not only emotionally and financially, but professionally. She edited his work. She smoothed over his outbursts. She created a space where he could thrive. And when she could no longer fit into the mold he needed, she was not only left behind, she was blamed. And that's something we need to confront. When Hemingway called Pauline on that final day and unleashed his rage, it wasn't just a private moment of cruelty. It was the culmination of years of entitled behavior, unchecked power, and societal complicity, because Hemingway had been taught by the world around him that his feelings, his art, and his needs were more important than the feelings, health, or safety of the women in his life. Even his son Gregory, in later interviews and writings, acknowledged this dynamic. He struggled for decades with the psychological consequences of being caught between a domineering father and a mother who was both his shield and, in his eyes, a casualty of that conflict. Gregory's journey through gender identity, addiction, and self-destruction is its own tragedy. But buried in his reflections is a profound awareness that his mother's life and death were never truly understood, not by the public, and perhaps not even by himself until it was too late. Which brings us to a broader cultural observation. For generations, we have trained ourselves to see stories like Pauline's as unfortunate but not unjust, as sad but not scandalous. We compartmentalize them, wrap them in the soft language of heartbreak and melancholy, rather than call them what they often are: casualties of emotional negligence, victims of psychological violence, and reminders of how unevenly history values contribution versus charisma. Pauline Pfeiffer wasn't erased because she lacked significance. She was erased because her kind of significance, quiet, steady, feminine-doesn't photograph well. It doesn't inspire myths. It doesn't sell books or line up with the romantic image of a tortured genius hammering out pages in a drunken stupor. Her strength was in her discipline. Her love was in her sacrifice. Her tragedy was in her silence. And that silence wasn't accidental. It was cultivated, reinforced, celebrated, even because when a woman like Pauline endures, when she continues to give without demanding, when she holds together a family, edits a manuscript, hosts a dinner party, births a child under risk of death, and still says nothing when she is discarded, we call her graceful. We call her strong. We call her dignified. But we never call her what she is: exhausted, wounded, and far too often unseen. In literary circles, we debate Hemingway's endings. Was a farewell to arms too bleak? Did the sun also rises capture disillusionment, or romanticize it? But what we rarely debate is the moral cost of the man behind the words. What it took to keep him functional. What it cost those who stood too close. Pauline paid that cost. And unlike Hemingway, who died with fame and recognition, she died with very little acknowledgement. Only in recent years have biographers and literary scholars begun to revisit her legacy with the seriousness it deserves. Not as a footnote, but as a foundation. Not as a detour in Hemingway's life, but as a formative architect of it. And so, as we begin to see her more clearly, we are also forced to ask harder questions. How many other Paulines have we forgotten? How many women have been quietly edited out of the stories they helped shape? How many genius men were, in truth, propped up by the silent, unpaid, and ultimately unsung labor of the women they left behind? As we begin to peel back the layers of Pauline Pfeiffer's story, we're forced to confront something much larger than one tragic life. We're staring directly into the architecture of legacy, the way cultural memory is built, whose voices are preserved, and whose sacrifices are quietly swept aside. And make no mistake, legacy isn't just what gets written down. It's what gets repeated, what gets glorified, and what we choose to remember versus what we choose to excuse. Pauline's absence from the center of the Hemingway myth isn't simply an oversight. It's a reflection of how history has long handled the women who support greatness without demanding credit. The unspoken rule seems to be this: if you're quiet, if you don't make noise, you become invisible. If you stay, suffer silently, and don't sabotage the man at the center. Your loyalty is remembered but only faintly, and only in service of his story. And this isn't just about Hemingway. Pauline's story resonates far beyond literary circles because the dynamic it exposes is everywhere. How often have we seen successful men artists, executives, politicians rise to prominence while the women beside them are reduced to roles? The wife, the assistant, the help? These aren't just titles. They are containers, and they're designed to keep women in them. Even when the woman is the editor, the strategist, the logistical genius, the emotional caretaker, her value is often measured only by proximity to his glow. Nowhere is this more obvious than in the case of Pauline's editorial contributions. Hemingway's early drafts of A Farewell to Arms were long, philosophical, and in places emotionally inaccessible. It was Pauline who encouraged him to cut through the intellectualism and reach for emotional clarity. And while critics debate how much influence she truly had, the fact that it's even a debate rather than accepted history says everything. Because we don't question how Hemingway influenced Pauline. We only question whether Pauline influenced Hemingway. That asymmetry is not accidental. It's the cultural result of how we evaluate contribution. Men's input is default. Women's input is conditional. Let's talk more about that imbalance. In the wake of Hemingway's rise, Pauline made herself small not out of weakness, but out of a deep sense of duty. She saw her role as essential but background. She believed in his gift and believed that making space for it was her calling. But this kind of sacrificial love is rarely honored. In fact, it's often exploited. Her financial contributions were enormous. Her family's wealth bought them a home, stability, time to write. Her editorial mind helped him hone a voice that would change American literature. Her body brought him 2 sons. Her silence preserved his image. And yet, when he moved on to Martha Gellhorn, Pauline wasn't remembered as the foundation he built upon. She was dismissed as the woman he left behind. That's how cultural memory works. It has a bias toward volume. Hemingway was loud in personality, in writing, in legend. Pauline was quiet, She lived in parentheses. And history has a nasty habit of deleting parentheses altogether. But something else deserves scrutiny here. The way Pauline's life and death were used to reinforce a particular narrative of male genius. In Hemingway's case, every major relationship in his life is framed as a turning point in his creative development. Hadley was Paris. Pauline was Key West. Martha was Spain. Mary was Cuba. As if each woman was a different literary era. As if their humanity didn't matter, only their symbolic function. That's the uncomfortable truth in the mythologizing of Hemingway. Women became geography, stages, themes, but not subjects. And this myth-making isn't just the work of biographers or scholars, it's something we all participate in, often without realizing it. We Leoneize certain personalities because they produce great art, and we assume their personal damage is either irrelevant or part of the package. But what if the art is only possible because someone else paid the emotional price? What if greatness, in some cases, is subsidized by the suffering of someone who will never be on the cover of the book? Let's bring it back to Pauline. After her death, there was no Pulitzer tribute. No cultural retrospective. She became part of the Hemingway estate, not the Hemingway conversation. Gregory, her son, eventually transitioned and took the name Gloria. He struggled with mental illness, addiction, and the lingering trauma of a childhood overshadowed by a father's condemnation and a mother's martyrdom. And yet, even he, in his writings, returned to Pauline not with bitterness but with reverence. He saw her for who she was, the quiet center of a chaotic world. That phrase, quiet center, is critical, because it challenges the idea that impact requires volume. Pauline wasn't loud. She wasn't visible. But her influence radiated through every part of Hemingway's life. His stability, his home, his work, his children. She wasn't the storm. She was the infrastructure that held through it. Until it couldn't. That distinction matters. Because we live in a world that still teaches girls to be accommodating, to stay in the background, to serve without seeking recognition. And then, when they're gone or broken, who struggle to even remember their names. Pauline's story asks us to reconsider that framework. It asks us to measure impact not just by who speaks the loudest, but by who holds the most weight, especially when that weight is invisible. Picking up where we left off, let's go straight into the hardest question this entire story forces us to face. What does it mean to love someone so completely that you disappear in the process? And when history forgets you, does your love and the cost of it still matter? Pauline Pfeiffer's story is, at its core, a meditation on devotion. Not just romantic devotion, but existential commitment, the kind that reshapes a life, redirects ambition, and redefines identity. She loved Hemingway in ways that were expansive and multidimensional. She gave him shelter, security, insight, clarity. She molded her world around his. And in doing so, she gave up pieces of herself, bit by bit, until very little remained. That kind of love is often called noble, but it's rarely called dangerous. And yet, as we've seen, for Pauline, it was both. It was noble in the sense that she gave deeply and intentionally. But it was dangerous because there was no reciprocal structure to support her. She wasn't seen, even by the man she loved, as someone who might one day need rescuing. She was the rescuer, the enabler, the steady hand. And in the end, her silence became her undoing. The tragedy here isn't just personal. It's systemic. We live in a culture that praises selflessness in women right up until it kills them. Pauline was the embodiment of the strong woman, trope, one who holds it all together, who asks for nothing, who carries the emotional load while making sure everyone else gets what they need. But strong doesn't mean invulnerable. And over time, that kind of strength without support doesn't build resilience. It builds fracture lines that eventually break. One of the cruelest ironies is that Pauline likely never believed she was a victim. She probably saw her choices as reasonable, maybe even righteous. In her letters and journals, she rarely complains. She expresses pain, yes, but not blame. She internalizes everything, taking on the burden of the situation, the guilt of the affair, the shame of being left behind, and later, the fear and confusion over her son's struggles. That kind of internalized suffering is invisible from the outside. It doesn't look like crisis. It looks like composure. It looks like a woman who's managing, a woman who has it all under control. Until she doesn't. We need to rethink how we define sacrifice. Too often, we romanticize it. We paint women like Pauline as tragic heroines, as if their fate was somehow poetic. But that lens is misleading. Sacrifice without recognition is not poetic. It's neglect, and the emotional toll it takes is cumulative, physical, and sometimes fatal. Pauline didn't die because she was weak. She died because she held too much, for too long, without ever being given the space to fall apart. And maybe that's the quietest tragedy of all, the way our culture trains women to break gracefully. So what does this mean for the rest of us? Why does Pauline's story, over 70 years later, still cut so deeply? Because her story is a mirror. It reflects the lives of so many women past and present who give their best years to someone else's dream, who build empires behind the scenes, who absorb the emotional fallout so others can stay composed, who sacrifice ambition for someone else's trajectory, who carry the shame of family secrets, the weight of unrealized futures, and the quiet ache of being needed but never seen. And perhaps most hauntingly, it reflects a pattern we still haven't broken. We still tell young women that their greatest value lies in who they support, not who they are. We still equate loyalty with silence. We still expect emotional labor to come without acknowledgement. And when women speak up, when they ask to be seen, to be credited, to be considered, theory often labeled difficult, dramatic, or worse. Pauline never asked for that recognition. But that doesn't mean she didn't deserve it. In the final analysis, what Pauline Pfeiffer teaches us is that legacy isn't just about who achieves greatness. It's about who made that greatness possible and what it cost them. Ernest Hemingway may have been the author, but Pauline helped write the margins. She carried the weight. She made the room, and she paid the ultimate price for it. Her death wasn't just the end of a life. It was the culmination of a system that devours those who support others too well, that asks for everything and offers so little in return. A system that calls women like Pauline supportive when what they really are is sacrificed. And maybe the hardest truth to face is this: we didn't just lose Pauline Pfeiffer once. In 1951, we've been losing her ever since. Every time we tell Hemingway's story and leave her name out, every time we talk about a farewell to arms without mentioning the woman who helped shape it, every time we use the word genius without asking, at what cost? Because the cost wasn't abstract. It had a name, a face, a body, a heart that finally couldn't take it anymore. And so, the next time we celebrate a legend, we should look a little closer at the edges of the story, the scaffolding, the uncredited hands, the silent rooms, because history, like Hemingway's fiction, often leaves out the most important parts, not out of malice, but out of convenience. And it's long past time we stopped letting silence write our history. So maybe the real question isn't whether Pauline Pfeiffer deserved more. Maybe it's whether we were ever ready to face what her story says about us, about the way we idolize the bold, the brilliant, the broken but ignore the ones who held them together, about how we chronicle genius while leaving out the wreckage it leaves behind. Because if a woman can give everything, her money, her mind, her body, her faith, her silence, and still be remembered as a footnote, then what exactly do we value? And who gets to decide which lives deserve a voice? Pauline didn't die in a novel. Her ending wasn't written with literary flourish. It happened in the quietest way imaginable. A phone call, a burst of adrenaline, a body that had finally absorbed too much. And yet, in that silence, there's a story that echoes louder than any of Hemingway's prosy reminder that real tragedy isn't always about loss. Sometimes, it's about never being seen in the first place. So perhaps the next time we admire a legend, we should ask not only who wrote the words, but who paid for the silence between them. Thank you for staying with us all the way through. If you found truth, reflection, or value in this story, don't let it fade away. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any truth that's been hidden in plain sight. See you next time.